this first virtual meeting for the Education and Business Scrutiny Commission. Please do please do flag at any time if my connection fails or you can't hear me, either by waving or using the raise hand function that you should see on your screen. I'm just going to work through some of the standard items that we need to kick off these virtual meetings. First, to flag that the session is being recorded and will be on the council's YouTube channel by tomorrow. Just to flag with everyone that when you join the meeting, your microphone will be muted automatically, and please, if you could remain on mute unless you're speaking, just to minimize background noise. And also, if you could wait until I ask you to come in before I'm muting your microphone, just to keep things manageable. And in terms of our general kind of like rules of engagement, as it were, if we could try and make sure that there's only one individual speaking at any given time, and that we let people finish without interruption. Although I might take the liberty to interrupt ever so slightly on occasion. If any member of the commission or someone else wants to speak, then you can you have two options. You can indicate via the chat function, or if your device has a raise hand function, you can use that. You can use that as well. Just to flag, if you do use the raise hand function, you need to put your hand down once you've got my attention. Other things to note. Just to flag, as the meeting's being recorded, for any non-members of the commission who wish to speak, you have the option of turning off your video if you don't want to be on the YouTube and you just want your sound to be on it. Otherwise, if you leave it on, we'll take it that you're okay with being videoed. And also to flag, if a member of the commission loses their connection, then we may take a brief break or adjournment just to try and re-add them to the session. In terms of what public members of the public can do, they're welcome to screenshot, tweet, or otherwise share proceedings of this meeting. And if any member wants a copy of the council's protocol for reporting and filming, that's available on the council's website as well. And just finally to flag, just in the interest of like health and safety, we'll probably take 5-minute breaks as near to the hour as we can, just so that people can look at something other than a screen. Okay, I think that's all the upfront stuff I've got to do. So getting into the actual agenda for the meeting now. Do we have any apologies? Julie, can you confirm?
No. Well, other than Lynette, she gave her apologies if she's unable to connect.
I thought I heard a hello from the.
Yeah.
Lynette and Martin are present.
Okay, great. So I'll do a roll call in a little bit, and you'll have to introduce yourself. Just to confirm who voting members are, I'll do a call out of people. So obviously there's myself, Councillor Peter Babudu. I'm chair of the Education and Business Scrutiny Commission. Could I next hand over to Councillor Hungbo to introduce yourself? You have to unmute yourself, William.
Councillor Hungbo from London Bridge, West Bermondsey. I'm the vice chair of this commission.
Thank you, William. I don't think is Councillor Easton present. No, so he's not present at the moment. Councillor Hambas?
Hello, I'm Councillor Renata Hambas, and I'm a member of this commission. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Councillor Kerslake?
Hi, Councillor Eleanor Kerslake, Councillor for Newington Ward and a member of the Commission.
Apologies all, we've hit Lorraine, and I actually have received an apology from Lorraine Lauder. She won't be able to join the meeting, so if we could add that to the apologies. Next, Councillor Mann, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a Councillor Mann from North Bermondsey Ward and also member of the Scrutiny Commission. And that's all I can say that. And you have to bear with me. My eyes are playing up, seeing too many lights.
Sure. Thanks as well. Lynette, if you're still with us, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Lynette Murphy-O'Dwyer, a co-opted member representing the Archdiocese of Southwark. Did that come through?
Yes, that came through fine. Apologies, I had a problem unmuting. Last but not least, Martin, are you on the line? Martin, if you are speaking, you're on mute. Okay, I'll give Martin a chance to introduce himself when he returns. And could I just check, Matt? You've currently got your hand raised. Is it a clarification? Go ahead. Matt, you're unmuted. Did you want to come in?
So two things. Firstly, no, I was hovering over that hand up, so it wasn't intentional. And then there was a delay in a bit like you releasing my mic. So hopefully that's been resolved now.
Great, good. Okay. So yeah, in terms of notifications of any urgent items of business, to flag that there are two late items that are contained in the supplementary agenda. That's the report from Chance UK relating to exclusions, and the report from Good People relating to procurement and planning. We also have an additional interviewee for this meeting, Matt Jones, who's a head teacher at Art Globe and the chair of SASH, the Southwark Association of School Head Teachers, will be giving evidence to the Commission as well. Thanks, Matt, for joining it, for managing to find the time to join. So those are the only urgent items. Unless, Julie, there's anything else?
That's it.
Good. Okay, so before we get into the meat of things, does anybody have any interest or dispensation that they wish to declare? Councillor Hungbo, your hand's raised. Do you want to come in? You are on mute. William, you're on mute. I think that you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, hear you now.
Yeah,
yes.
I was just saying the Mac is taking long to activate. I think someone has the same problem. Yeah. Anyway, just to declare that I'm one of the school governor for Tower Bridge Primary School.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. And item 4 on the agenda is the minutes of the previous meeting. You'll have that in your pack for the meeting held on the 13th of February. Voting members happy that that's a correct record? You can indicate to me just by nodding your head, waving your hand, or in the chat.
Yes.
Right, thank you. All right, fantastic. So ahead of item 5, if it's all right, I'm going to suggest that in terms of our urgent addition that we go to Matt Jones first, just to lead this in. So Matt has, in his role as chair of Southwark's Association of School Head Teachers, is particularly attuned to our considerations around exclusions in Southwark. I'll let him fully introduce himself, but he also did participate in the Timpson review, which we paid a lot of attention to through the course of this commission. And I've asked Matt to speak to us, not so much in his context as head teacher at Art Globe, but more in his role as chair of SASH. So trying to give us overall perspective in terms of exclusions in Southwark and kind of what's driven the increase and how that might best be tackled. And we're also particularly interested to hear about Matt's thoughts in terms of what schools and the council kind of together in partnership can do to tackle the trend of rise in exclusions. Matt, if it's okay, maybe you could open with up to kind of 10 minutes if you'd like, and then we'll open up to members for questions. Feel free to be briefer if you prefer us to focus on the questions.
Yeah, I think I have read the papers. There's maybe a few questions that people would like to ask around the proposal going forward in terms of the charter and ambition for 100% inclusion. But I'll introduce myself first, go through some of the key themes and issues for schools, not only locally, but as Peter mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be part of and contribute to the Timpson review. So I did get around the country to see some of the practice being followed in other local authorities and other school settings. So firstly, let me say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts and share our experiences. I want to start off by firstly stating that I'm very proud to be chair of SASH. I work with a wonderful group of head teachers, and just for point of clarification, SASH acronym stands for Southwark Association of Secondary Heads. There's a different organisation that represents the primary phase. And having been in the area now for 8 years and at Globe for 8 years, I've become familiar with the local structures and the local head teachers. And what I can say is that the head teachers who I work with and interact with are wholeheartedly behind reducing exclusions. And much of our talk that we have at meetings are around exclusions, but moreover, the support that needs to be in place that can reduce the number of exclusions. Every single exclusion, whether it's fixed or permanent, is a failure of multiple agencies and local provision. And so let me start by saying that schools don't work on this in isolation. They're part of an ecosystem locally that needs to function in order to function efficiently in order to reduce exclusions through various means, which I'll come on to later. But when we talk about exclusions, I think the first view is always of the person on the receiving end of that exclusion. And we know well, and it's well documented in the reports provided, the impact of exclusions. And every single head teacher thinks very, very deeply about excluding this student, even for a fixed term exclusion, let alone a permanent exclusion. And a permanent exclusion is at the end of multiple interactions and or interventions. thank goodness that the legislation nationally has been changed, which means that it is very, very difficult to permanently exclude a child, and that is, and rightly so. So the exclusions do occur. They're last resort for many head teachers, and we need to put the student on the receiving end of that exclusion front and foremost. At the same time, we need to balance the needs and the well-being and safety of other people in a school community, typically teachers, who are often on the end of violent or verbal abuse as a consequence of some of the behaviours, the student peers whose learning is disruptive, and in worst cases their safety is at risk. And my first responsibility, and any principal or head teacher's first responsibility, is to safeguard all the young people in their institution, and then the adults, and then make sure that they get an excellent education. So you can see the balancing act that many head teachers face. And so in the first instance, let's have a shared assumption that, and I'm sure we do, the head teachers go to exclusions as a last resort and as a position whereby they're thinking about the needs, desires and safety of other people in their community. I suspect then the other thing that would be pertinent to raise here would be some of the challenges that may have impacted on the increase in exclusions. And so these are many factors beyond the individual control of school teachers. So, for example, and you'll be acutely aware of this, the funding for various levels of intervention, be it social care, mental health, early help, has been dramatically reduced over the past decade. And that inevitably has an impact on how organisations, not just schools, other institutions can support some of the families. So that's one challenge. I think the other challenge that we all face is the impact on our young people of some of the social conditions in which they grow up. And it's interesting to note that although Southwark has some of the highest rate of exclusions, simultaneously it's got some of the highest rates for knife crime, some of the highest rates for gun crime in the area. And those things are not disconnected, and they impact on our young people in our community, either through exploitation, either they're perpetrators themselves, or they fear those aspects. So there's a social context that have also potentially impacted on the increase in exclusions. However, I'm pleased to say that more recently there has been some efforts in reducing exclusions locally by greater partnership between head teachers. So it's very rare now that individuals will be excluded for a single serious offence, permanent exclusion. What we try to do locally between us in the education sector is to negotiate either respite provision, so that the young person is removed from the community, has an intervention into another school, and or, and please feel free to clarify what we mean by managed move process. But to reduce permanent exclusions, we try what we call a managed move, which is a system where we negotiate with another principal or head teacher to take the student on after a trial period in a new setting, to give them a second or even in some cases third chance. So that's the sort of local perspective. I'll go on to some of the problems that we are trying to solve. And first and foremost, it is trying to resolve and change entrenched behaviours, often due to, not exclusively, and in no particular order, ineffective parenting, the victims or the witnesses of some form of abuse, physical abuse, and or emotional abuse, sometimes neglect, either in the home or in the community, and many issues for around mental health, which affect not just the young person, but often in the families. So if you could say that they are the broader suite of issues that we're trying to manage, not just in schools, but the health service, NHS, and no doubt some of the other services provided by the local authority, they're just generic issues that we're all facing. and then to get to even better outcomes in terms of reducing the rates of exclusion, I think we quite clearly we need to identify the most effective and holistic interventions. We can go on to what they could possibly be and what's been proven to work. We need to create the appropriate and effective structures for the commissioning, the delivery of, and the evaluation of these interventions. Too often, my experience has been working in the sector that people do things because they feel it's right, it sounds like a good idea, but they're not adequately evaluated. Moreover, institutions with broad responsibility for reducing outcomes or promoting inclusion often feel the need to be the deliverers of that service, which may not be the right outcome. They may not be the best people to deliver the various interventions. And then fourthly, then what needs to be considered is how we appropriately fund those interventions. And funding clearly is going to be an issue if we're going to resolve this, I wouldn't say crisis, but if we're going to be successful in going for that very ambitious objective of 100% inclusion. And then finally, before I take any questions, if anyone has any additional clarity that they would like me to provide, is that there are two ways you can look at solving this issue. There's an iteration of what we currently have, the model, i.e., do not change the structure, just get people better at doing what they do through training, and or making sure that their services are deployed in a timely fashion with a robust evaluation. Or there's a more radical approach, which is to change the structures, empower the people who are on the front line dealing daily with the families and children who have those relationships, and by giving them the autonomy and also the resource, allow them locally in small hubs or in sub areas of Southwark to deal with the issue and work in combination with other schools to reduce the exclusions. So you can continue with, which I perceive to be, and I've looked at models across the country as part of the Timson review, the sort of local authority led, commissioned and delivered service, or you can move to a more integrated schools-based and schools-led service. And just for your information, what we found nationally is that the services or the model that has the best outcomes in terms of exclusions and or reducing or promoting inclusion are the schools-led models, where they are given a resource and the accountability and the commissioning power to reduce and support young people. So reduce exclusions and support young people.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I might ask you to just tell me I'm getting quite a bit excellent one. I think well, I have a number of questions, but I'll open up first. We've had question and as well. So William.
Thank you, Matt, for your presentation. I agree with you that there's a local ecosystem around the school that we need to pay attention to. And also there's a need of cooperation between different stakeholders in the community. When I say could be with the faith group, the families, also institutions active in the community because there is particularly in Southwark, we have a situation where the knife crime and the drug dealings has been affecting most of our youth who are victims used as foot soldiers. I just want to find out if, I know at your level at the SASH, you have set up some plan and you want to implement to improve the situation. I just want to find out if the teachers, because the teachers are in the front line and they have to face those young people every day, what kind of support or training for them to be aware of the local situation. Because some teachers, they may teach around here, they may not live here, and they may not have a very clear understanding of the dynamic. Thank you, Matt.
Okay,
That's a really good point that you make there, William, about training. And so there's training in two senses. There's training about an understanding of the context and of Southwark and of the young people that live in Southwark, but then there's training for the interventions. How do you intervene? So once you know the context, then understanding the interventions. What I would say that in the first instance around understanding the context, they will have been exposed to numerous sessions, both in school, at least once or twice a year, depending on the school, around the local context, because what we have to do statutory is deliver safeguarding training, and that will inevitably touch on many of these areas. So I'm confident that the local head teachers and the staff who work in those schools are familiar with the context. And certainly at SASH meetings, we are very aware of it, because we invite Nina Dole, Director of Education, and the local police service to our meetings every half term. So we're well informed around that. The training for teachers is another issue, and a bit like what I alluded to earlier, which is there will be some generic training that most schools will do around behaviour management, climate for learning, call it what you will, i.e., maintaining good order in your school. But training to intervene effectively with an educator, i.e., a qualified teacher, may not be the best outcome. And this is where I talk about commissioning the right intervention delivered by the right people. And so if we take, for example, an issue of persistence disorder in a classroom that is emanating from a lack of trust or a lack of adult role models, then the teacher may not be the best person to be able to build that trust, because we have to hold them to account for all sorts of different things. And so what we may be able to do is commission other services that provide that support. Teachers, I would say humbly, have a myriad of things that they have to deliver exceptionally well in terms of, the teaching and keeping the children safe. I think there are other institutions, organisations or groups who can be commissioned to do that more intensive work at a much higher skilled level. If it's their day job, I'm just convinced that they'll be more successful than a teacher who is worried about curriculum changes, assessment, and the behaviour in the individual classroom. Let's identify which interventions work best and get the best people trained to do that and get them into schools.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. We've got questions from Lynette and Renata. Could I suggest that we try and group those, just to make sure that we've got time to get through everything? So Lynette, do you want to start us off?
Thank you. That was very helpful, very illuminating. I just have a couple of questions. One is about the communication and with primary schools when the children transition to secondary, and how their needs and their support needs are communicated. Because in my experience as a chair of a primary school, I know that some schools are extremely assiduous about this, and the young child continues on a positive path with the support. And in other cases, children that we know left our primary school on the right path by a half term in the secondary school, because they had no support at all, were then facing permanent exclusion. So I wonder if you could comment on that. And then I have one other follow-up comment.
Are you okay to just, you can say both questions up front, we'll take them together.
The other point that I wanted to raise was Do you have a mechanism when you do your budgeting to prioritise, for instance, the necessary additional funding that you need to support children who are send children who are have particular, for instance, mental health needs or other needs? And I will let other people ask other questions now.
Fantastic, Lynette, really good questions. So one on transition to secondary, and the second on budgeting and necessary additional funding for children with SEND. Could I just take Eleanor's question as well? Then Matt, maybe you can come back on the three of those.
Thanks, Lynette, and thanks for taking time to speak to us, Matt. So I think you've kind of half actually answered my question, but I was really interested in what you were saying about a kind of more sort of structural approach versus something more kind of radical and closer to the kind of people providing care and providing education. And I just wondered if you could give us some like actual examples, maybe from your work on the Timpson Review, of kind of where you think structural things gone badly and where a kind of more like kind of close to the source approach has gone well, just so we can kind of understand what that might look like in Southwark.
Great. Matt, do you want to come back on those?
Yeah, absolutely. So primary transition, ironically, today, Lynette, I was in another Teams meeting. Seems like I spend all day in Teams meetings and all evening on this occasion with primary heads, talking about this very significant and important issue. One reason being that transition during COVID is going to be extremely difficult, but two, to future-proof the transition process. So let me tell you what we do and what we have done and what we're aiming to do. So firstly, out of secondary budgets, we provide the transportation and the disbursement of the student file from the primary. So we take that responsibility to make sure that we provide the travel, the packaging for those files to come across. And that may seem sort of rudimentary, but let me assure you, having worked 8 years in Southwark and working with a family, looking at a file only to then go back to the school to find that they've left part of an important piece of information in their school. So transferring all the relevant documentation is one thing that the secondary heads manage and support primaries with. Secondly, in terms of the information, the dialogue, now you're right, it does vary between schools, and the conversation today was for us to set up a minimum expectation from both sides, because although I respect your experience, you may have had difficulty contacting some maybe of our less engaged secondary schools. I can be equally frank that on occasions it's been very difficult to contact a primary school around a certain child and the additional information. So that two-way process needs to be refined, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be clear, and we were working on that today. And so on the transfer form that we've created in conjunction with our primary colleagues, and again, it sounds a bit rudimentary, but nevertheless it's an obvious own goal, that both on the form we're going to put both the lead contact from the primary school and the secondary school. So there's a detail of the person's contacts and how you can reach into either school. And the form we've created, again in consultation with the primary school, lists all the characteristics and information that you would expect to see. And it's a responsibility of the primary school to complete that and send it off to the secondary school with the details of the contact in the secondary school who's leading on that process. So I hope that answers your question, that we're firstly transferring of all the files, all the relevant paperwork is important so that we're well informed. Secondly, that we are liaising with our primary colleagues around the process and the type of form, and that on that form there's an opportunity for the primary school to indicate that they would like a further discussion with the secondary school around any particular child where there may be some issues.
Just to clarify one, the children and the Senko. Sorry, there's a
Can you repeat that?
It was just me. I wasn't able to hear much of that. But, I might also say, Lynette, if it's possible to use the chat, just then that would be great, and maybe we can find a way to fit it in with the other questions.
You're now asking me a technical question. Can you just indicate what chat is on the?
Oh, apologies. If you can see a kind of slightly rectangular with a triangle at the end box, it looks like a speech bubble. Great.
No, that's not it. Is it the share button? No.
No. If you see 3 dots, then you kind of keep on going right, not a hand.
3 dots.
And then you see a box after that with like 2 lines on it. Or
sorry,
something.
beg your pardon, everybody.
Yeah.
Just
no problem in that. We're getting used to
it. Yes, I just wondered what.
Could I ask Matt to just so sorry, Lynette, I don't mean to cut you off. I just want to make sure we get to everyone's questions. Do you mind if we let Matt continue to answer? Thank you.
Yeah, so on the budgeting and the SEND requirement, typically schools spend way over the allocation for SEND. There's been a couple of challenges around SEND. One, the challenge of getting a recognised diagnosis of need. That has been much more challenging in recent years. You would know nationally that the identification of SEND and EHCP is reduced, and that's no accident. I think that's a correlation between the reduction in funding, and I recognise the challenge from local authority perspective. You've got a finite resource, you know, we want to allocate it to the highest needs, but then there are other students who get missed out. So that's one issue, but let me assure you that disproportionately we spend money on our most challenging students, and I wouldn't want to associate SEND with exclusions, because that is just one part of the story, and it's not a part of the story for most exclusions, from my experience. And then finally, just to give an indication, at Globe, I spend approximately £300,000 a year on additional needs for our needy students, over and above what we get for individual SEND budget for the culmination of the students that we have in the school. So funding that we have, none of it is ring-fenced, save for the for identified needs and SEND students, but we disproportionately spend on our most needy students. Okay, I can assure you that happens. And then going on to Eleanor's question around the structures, and firstly, and I wouldn't want to call out any other local authority who may not be doing it brilliantly, as that would be very unfair of me. And equally so, I think I wouldn't want to try to identify a model or a local authority doing something similar, because I think this is unique to each individual area. And what I did find is that when we went around the country, there were variations on the theme of that spectrum between central, local authority controlled and school-based model. And some of the school-based models didn't work as effectively as some of the local authority driven models. So there's no pure or linear progression about X is bad and then you go along to the Y is good. What I would say, in having discussions with both locally with Peter John, Nina, Dole, Peter, to an extent, is what the model could look like is that you create hubs around a main school or the foundation school, call it what you will, including primaries, where the services are commissioned by that hub based on the local need, because I'll be very clear, and many of you know better than me, that the needs in the south of the borough may be not as intensive as they are in the north and northwest of the borough. So creating those hubs where you empower the teachers or the head teacher or the hub committee to make the best decisions based on the students in front of them and the issues that they face is one. Secondly, you have to find mechanisms of holding them to account. So a reporting system back into the local authority, a body such as this, by each hub to justify and evaluate the interventions and the impact of that. And finally, and this is the biggest challenge, the repurposing or the reallocation of the professionals to be based more in the community and less in remote buildings where they're not part of the local community and they don't know the families or the students on the local level. And one of the problems is that an intervention is identified, but the people delivering the intervention don't feel part of the community. Then for the students and the families they're working with, there's a lack of trust, and that familiarity and that constant contact will make a difference. And I'll give an example, but in a different, with a different institution or different service, is the police service. And historically at Globe, when I arrived, the fear and anxiety towards the police service was palpable. There's a deep mistrust. They didn't engage with the police in a meaningful way. Having a school's safer police officer has meant that our students will go to our PC because they know him, they build relationships, and he can go around to their house or go out in the community and have the intervention or make the intervention, which will 9 times out of 10 the young person will respond well to or better to than if they hadn't had that relationship. So getting the professionals to change their model of working and where they're based will enable that relationship and that trust to be enhanced and therefore lead to better outcomes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. I'm conscious of time, so I'm so sorry. I think there's an echo on your line. Do you mind briefly? So we've got one outstanding question from sorry, let me mute you. We've got one outstanding question from Renata, but I also wanted to chuck one into the mix as well. And really, it was just you spoke about some of the ideas we have in our reports, and that's firstly around this ambition for 100% inclusion and a mutually agreed charter. So kind of the first recommendation, and then also our recommendation about greater school council partnership. You kind of alluded to it a bit, but just really, what do you think needs to happen for these recommendations to actually be delivered against? Or do you think it's realistic that we could go down the route of a more ambitious partnership, explicitly trying to get the goal like 100%?
So I did hear the first part. You broke up a bit. So I think you were alluding to is that first ambition of 100% inclusion appropriate, realistic? Was that what you're asking on the first instance?
Yes. And again,
it's a really bad line, Peter. I'll go with that. You might want to put it in the chat, but you're going to talk about the 100% inclusion, how we can achieve that and what it would take, and then what would the structures be or the mechanisms that will facilitate that. And so if that's what you're asking, I'll just chug on, and if you put something in the chat and redirect me, that'd be fine. So the 100% inclusion and what would it take to do that? So I'll go from a deficit model, which is why do we have high rates of exclusion? It's not because we don't know who the children are. It's not because we don't know what the problems are. It's the quality of the intervention and the timely commissioning and the application and delivery of that intervention. So how would that work locally? I think the big challenge is what services are currently being identified, which services are currently being delivered by Southwark, and I will be specific around the early help team and what does that look like and how we evaluated their impact. And if we feel that's a good resource and is having impact, then fine, and that's going to be a decision for other people to make. But if we feel that they're not having desired impact, what would it mean to reallocate, one, the financial resource, but two, the people resource to effectively work with hubs? So if we were talking about the setting up of a local hub, it's identifying the governance structure for the local hub, who would be part of that local hub, the governance structure for that local hub, and the systems for holding that hub to account. If we can get that structure in place, and you put the accountability on schools to work with each other and commission their own intervention, then I think that the head teachers and the local education system would support that very ambitious objective of 100% inclusion, with the caveat that on occasion, for the benefit of the others in the community, that a permanent exclusion may be necessary. But just looking at the data in the local authority, I suspect, and this is having conversations with various people, that I think we can move those rates of exclusion. My ambition would be to get those down to single figures, permanent exclusions. I think that is possible and we still have to be ambitious to get it down to zero, but I think there's some factors beyond our control that we may sometimes have to resort to permanent exclusion. And I'm hoping that I also sneaked into the second part of your question, which was the structures and how we implement the strategy. Did I give you enough there, Peter, or would you like some more?
Yeah, that's great. Hopefully I'm audible now. Could we just have a last question from Renata?
Chair, I would like to...
Okay, a last question from Renata and Eliza, please.
It's me.
Hello. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Matt, very much. That was a very enlightening presentation. Now, I'm going to sort of throw a spanner in the works because I know we probably can't put much about this into the document that the Commissioner is being put together by the Commission. But in light of COVID-19 and that many children who were vulnerable are supposed have been allocated space at schools and they're not going to school, what do you think the impact of that is going to be? Well, everything I've read, it sounds like not many of those children who you would like to be in school, what vulnerable ones who are more likely to end up being excluded. What do you think the impact of that's going to be?
Renata, thank you very much. And it's interesting to say, because we were meant to, obviously, and we have been providing during COVID on-site provision for our vulnerable students. In the first couple of weeks, we had 0 students access that, vulnerable students, that is, and then we've gone up to 1 or 2 students using that facility, and we have identified about 30 students. So you're right to raise this question. What impact is COVID going to have on the most vulnerable? It's going to be significant in 2 ways. Firstly, just missing the formal education is obviously going to put them further behind. Typically, vulnerable students are also the ones who academically underachieving, and that gap's going to widen. But we've also found that even though schools have been shut, or for the majority of students, we've also been engaging with them remotely. And vulnerable students, having looked at the data for Globe and anecdotally had the feedback from other secondary heads, they're the ones who have not been completing the work online or engaging in live streamed lessons. So there's going to be a very hugely significant academic gap, but there's also going to be a social gap, a behaviour gap. And for many of our young people, vulnerable people, for the reasons that I alluded to earlier around ineffective parenting or negative influences in their community, schools are the best place in which they develop many of the behaviours that we hope they go on to display in adult life. And without that socialisation of schools and putting in those norms and those routine and rituals that help shape young people, I think their behaviour and personal characteristics may be detrimentally affected by not having that conditioning. I say conditioning in the kindest sense in school, where they've got their boundaries set, expectations are clear, and consequences are also followed up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Eliza, do you want to ask the last question?
Yes, Chair. I just wanted to ask, thank you for the brief. It's very interesting. My concern right now, because of the lockdown and COVID virus, and the scientists and the World Health Organization saying this is going to be here for another couple of years or more. So all these recommendations, is it workable, feasible to really apply now? Don't we think differently now how to reach out to those excluded children and educate them in their own home? Because most of the children are learning from internet now. So already the system is already in place. Lots of children are learning from there. So it will be safe for the excluded children. They will be home, and also the teachers can monitor whether they are studying or not, rather than putting them in different places, different buildings, and changing their environment. It's causing them a lot of confusion. I think this COVID did some help to the children, and we need to think a different way of educating these school excludees and vulnerable children, and this will be more cheaper and more safer, and we can monitor them very closely. So do you think we need to think a little bit more creatively and differently if it's going to last for 2 years?
Matt, so you're on mute.
Okay, I can't hear it.
I'm just waiting for it to come off mute. Yeah. Yes. So that's a really interesting point, and I think sometimes a crisis leads to innovation and even better solutions. Firstly, I'm hoping and praying it doesn't last for 2 years. I hope that we're back in school early June in some form, and by September, most of the school will be back in some sort of structure. But the point you make about using technology to facilitate or add to the suite of interventions for students who may be excluded is a valid point. And we've been thinking deeply about how we can, in the short term, use that technology to ensure that students do not miss out on their education when they're excluded. But what I will repeat is what I said a moment ago, is the formal education is just part of the story. And so, yes, there can be systems and technology used to help with their formal learning. But I would humbly suggest that an excluded student needs to be in a socialized context so they learn the behaviors of how to interact with each other, because most of the exclusions will be about their interaction, their social interaction with their peers or adults. And unless they're in an environment where they get to practice that and get to see it modeled, then I think that having a solution whereby they're spending most of their time on their own in their room with their family will not lead to that improvement in behaviors. And finally, what I would say around that, and you'll know as well as I do, that not every home has the same access to the right technology to the right level. And so that would also be a barrier that we would have to overcome. But I do take your point, Eliza. We are thinking creatively about, in the short term, what could an exclusion look like? And so just last minute on this, which is exclusion typically means that the child goes home, they may get some work to do, and whether they complete it in their home or not, we find out when they return. This is for a fixed term exclusion. What we're thinking about is how do we use technology to make sure that when they are excluded, that they are doing appropriate and a copious amount of work to keep that exclusion impact to a minimum, and when they come back into school they can pick up on their learning. But in summary, I think the technology can enhance the offer, not replace it.
So much, Matt, your presentation and for answering people's questions. So again, that's been really that's a really useful contribution to the commission, which I'm sure we can kind of work in some way into our recommendations. I'm going to take this opportunity to give us a 5-minute break just to look away from the screens. The general suggestion on other calls I've been is that people switch off your, keep the connection up, but switch off your cameras and your mics, just so you don't forget and put anything silly on YouTube. We'll rejoin at 7:05, if that's okay. And Matt, feel free to get on with your life, but you're of course welcome.
Martin, I see you joined to the end there.
seen Timmy.
Are we all in?
Welcome back, folks. Can I just check? Do we have us here? William, are you here? Are you back? Could I just remind people afresh to mute when they're not speaking, please? Right. I think there's a few people not on mute. Are you okay to mute, please? Great. So we'll jump right back into things. Item 5 on the agenda is relating to the procurement review, and it will be feedback from the lead cabinet member and officers on the opportunities for local procurement via Section 106 obligations. So if we could maybe start off with Johnson and officers introducing themselves, and then I appreciate if you could give a first kind of maximum 10 minutes before we go.
I won't take any longer than 10 minutes. I'm conscious that you have already received the briefing as well. So Johnson Situ, I'm Councillor and Cabinet Member for Growth, Development and Planning, and I am joined by Alistair Huggett, if you want to introduce yourself very quickly.
Alistair Huggett, I'm the Planning Projects Manager in the Planning Department.
And
for Section 106.
And Danny Edwards, I saw earlier as well.
Thanks, Johnson. Danny Edwards, Chief Exec's Office, Local Economy Team Manager.
Okay. So again, I will be brief. I'm conscious that you have received a note. Firstly, I think it's really important to welcome the fact that the Commission is looking at this piece of work. And I welcome that fact because we have 16,000 registered businesses in the borough, the vast majority of them SMEs, and somewhere in the region of 96%. And as a borough, we are absolutely committed to both SMEs and growing and have ambitious plans for growth in the borough, and that's all hinged and centered around our small and medium businesses as well. I guess the question is, how do we do that? So we have 3 ways of doing that. I know you're going to be looking at a number of them, but I'll be specifically talking about the role Section 106 and planning plays in this. There is, of course, the route through procurement. I know you'll be discussing that. There is a role that we have as through our local economy and our partnerships right across the local economy. And that final part in respect of planning authority and the role we play through Section 106 agreements. So how we recognise it in a Section 106 agreement is through a commitment within the Section 106 agreement, which encourages and requires 10% of construction contracts for developers to go to local businesses and SMEs, and that's very much us proactively encouraging developers to go out and do that. How we currently monitor that at the moment and how we look to encourage developers at the moment is through specific wording which says reasonable endeavours. Now, what that actually means in practice is that we would encourage developers to, as they're developing their contracts, to put clear links with both the local economy team and also to advertise locally as well. And there is a question and there's a discussion about monitoring moving forward. And then also we look at how we build up those relationships with our strategic relationships with developers right across the piece, and how we both encourage working with local SMEs, but also employment as well. And what's the vision? Well, the vision is to ensure that, as I've said before, that we are growing our SMEs, we're supporting them, and also we're providing and acting as a facilitator between big developers who are investing in the area and smaller businesses as well. And we have done this through the local economy, and we have strong commitments in terms of employment as well. I guess there is a big question, and this is why I welcomed the fact that the Commission is looking at this. There is a question as to whether we can go further in respect of the relationship with SMEs and that commitment of 10% of construction. And we've explored ideas of how we could go further, and I note your recommendation as well, so happy to take any points on that. But a couple of things that we've talked about in terms of how we could go further. We recognise that whilst we monitor at the moment, we could go further in monitoring, and there is specific work as to how we could develop that. So requiring developers at each stage to have a statement of intent, which is at each phase talk about how they will go about ensuring that 10% of their contracts are going to local small and medium businesses, will be a way for us to monitor it more proactively and also to get live information, which is important. We have strong strategic relationships in key areas of growth for us. So we've got significant town centre growth right across the borough. And I think there is a question and something that we will rise to that challenge in terms of how do we have a specific pilot in our town centres, and the Oak Kent Road seems like an immediate example in which we can show, well, this is what it would look like, and almost set a standard in which other developers, we can challenge them and say, well, it is possible because this is how we've done it on the Oak Kent Road. And I know you've looked at examples of where that's been done in neighbouring boroughs as well. And also looking at long term, we are reviewing our Section 106 and SIL SPD as well. And so always looking at how we improve on wording and give additional priority. I think there are limitations as to what we can do because of legal advice.
Just for clarity, you want to tell people SIL and SPD stands.
Oh, okay, sorry. My apologies. So Section 106 is an agreement that codifies all of the community benefit. Community infrastructure levy, which is SIL, which is a recent legislation that was introduced a few years back, specifically is a levy on all new developments of a certain size, which supports the community infrastructure needed. So whether it be education, infrastructure, wider infrastructure such as community spaces as well, SIL goes towards that, and transport as well. Now, the guiding policy document that supports that is our Section 106 and SIL SPD, and we're looking to review that. And what we would be able to look at when reviewing that is there an opportunity to strengthen the wording around particular areas of focus? As I was going to say, it's, there is a balancing act to be had here, because we do know there are limitations to which we can enforce any stringent requests from developers on this particular area in respect of trading with businesses and small and medium businesses, particularly within the local area because of competition law. But I think there is a question as to, when we are reviewing it, how we ensuring we're living up to our commitment and living up to our priorities in that sense as well. Of course, balancing it with our wider priorities within the Section 106 commitments of supporting education, supporting employment more widely, and also addressing some of the wider community infrastructure that we also want to see as well. I will just briefly end on noting that you have looked at some specific recommendations, and I wanted to briefly just talk about recommendation 9 because I may not be around for that part of the meeting, so I apologise if I'm not able to be around for that part of the meeting. But I think it is welcomed, and I think that specific focus would be good. I think there would be a question as to how we could maybe look at a specific pilot, which will give us the flexibility of taking on board that legal advice and saying, how do we explore this in a specific pilot, say the Oak Kent Road, where we're working with a developer proactively, and how that develops on ensuring that they are using a portion of their contracts to support small and medium businesses. I'll leave it there because I'm conscious that you may have questions, and Alison and Danny are around to pick up any questions you might have as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that answer. Kept the time great. Again, I do have questions. Others lead. And could I ask as well, on the line. For those who are able to use the chat functionality, could you please flag if you've got a question there, just so we don't miss you? I will ask around for those who can't use it, but if you do have chat functionality, please flag it there. So far, I have William. So, do you want to answer your question? And if we could try and take them in sets, please.
Thank you, Councillor Situ. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Situ, for your presentation. Developing infrastructures and also alleviating social issues is, for me, the best way to go further. Those development projects that we had has benefited the big developers, but some small businesses have not been taking advantage of it. So there is a sort of inequality between the businesses. And particularly now that we are entering the recession, as you're aware, a global recession, is going to be harder for the small businesses. I just want to know if you have any plan in terms of any online campaign to assist those small business, local businesses who sometimes are not really aware of the opportunity that we have here. I think for me personally, it would be the best way to go further. Thank you.
That's true. I'm conscious, Johnson, come back on that to the extent you can. I'm conscious that it may go somewhat beyond your brief as well, but to the extent you can, or Danny wants to say something around it.
No, hello. Yes. No, I can come back on. I'll come back on that. You know, Councillor Hungway, you raise a really important point, which is, you know, we are seeing significant growth and investment in the area, and what we don't want to see, and is part of a key driver of all of our policies, is that divide between the vast majority of businesses not being able to see the benefits of that growth or not having access to that growth. So it's an absolute priority for us, and that's why we both have the commitments that I've talked about in the planning world, but we even go further in terms of the local economy world. We have significant commitments in terms of how we're supporting small businesses and significant projects as well. But I'll particularly talk about the point you're raising in respect of how we are encouraging small businesses to find out about these opportunities. One thing that we are currently doing, and I think there is a question, and we need to consistently review whether we can go further, is that we are requiring all developers, and we're asking all developers to advertise locally when they have an opportunity in respect of contracts as well, so that small and medium businesses can know about those contracts and be able to put a bid in. I guess there is a question as to you know, to what degree is that advertising medium, and will people know about it? But certainly I'm happy to provide more information, and we do ask that they use recognized mediums such as newspapers, local newspapers, and also local advertising boards as well. But there's always more that could be done, and that's certainly the reason why I identified it as areas for future work as well. And finally, you talked about, you know, in this particular pandemic, there is, you know, as we look to what the future will hold in many ways, we know there is a significant recession, and it's by all accounts mentioned by the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well. And we know that high streets and our town centres are going to be significantly hit as well. And any investment that's coming into the area, we're going to be absolutely working as hard as possible. And I know the local economy team will be leading this charge to ensure that that funnels through down to the local business and small businesses as well. And whether that's, you know, local economy projects, or whether that's advertising through Section 6 and still, there is a key challenge moving forward, is how do we ensure that we're not losing the vast majority of businesses that we have in the borough. As I've said, 96% of our businesses are small or micro businesses. So, you know, what I'd like to do is reassure you that this is a huge concern to us in respect to post-COVID as well, and how we're ensuring we're supporting small businesses.
Thank you, Johnson. Eliza, do you want to come in?
Yes, me, Eliza? Okay, thank you, Councillor Johnson. And I would like to ask the question about the developers, especially Tideway. They were given to work from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m., especially during this lockdown. Children are at home, all the families are home, they're doing a breaking concrete. So I'm inundated with a lot of phone calls. I know the Secretary of State allowed that, but they still have to come to the council to get permission. And is it possible that you can limit the time, especially during this lockdown period?
Johnson, feel free to come, or Alison, feel free to come if you like. But I'm eager that we try and focus on the business of this commission, particularly just given time.
It is also developer doing the business.
But just so we can focus around the emphasis of this commission website.
I'm very happy to briefly come in on. I know Alistair will be able to come in with much more detail, but what you're referring to is the recent announcement by the Secretary of State, MHCLG, in respect of construction hours and trying to stimulate construction. And our position is simple on this, which is we recognise the benefits of construction to the local economy, to the wider economy, but it cannot be at an inconvenience to residents in a densely populated area. And so what we're saying is that any request that we receive, we will be taking due regard to the fact that it's a densely populated area. We will obviously be making that decision on environmental protection reasons, and I'm sure Alistair will be able to come in. But if there is a specific case, do let us know. We'll be happy to look into it. But Alice, I'm not sure if you want to come.
Could I maybe hold that on that? Just because I'm conscious of time, and Johnson had the question. Okay. Could I have Councillor then I'll follow up my own questions.
So, Peter, was that my question?
Yes, that's so go ahead with the question.
Thank you, Johnson. Thanks for I don't know if you.
So, Johnson, could you please?
Is that okay? Is that clearer? Great. So no, apologies because you probably weren't preparing for this side of our scrutiny. But the other kind of bit of the procurement that we're looking at is whether the council's procurement can help BME businesses. And I wonder if you've got a view on kind of within your kind of remit, what regeneration can do on that aspect. And from what I've seen, particularly in Peckham, there's been some quite innovative things the council has done with Peckham Levels and Peckham Palms. And so I just wondered if you had any views on that for the committee.
Can you hear me? Always just have to check that everybody can hear me before I start. No, it's an important point that we do have an opportunity, particularly within regeneration as well as procurement, to be able to support our BAME businesses. And we know that particularly a significant proportion of our small businesses are BAME owned as well. So, when we are talking about our wider projects, it is a specific area of focus as well. In terms of regeneration, our view is that regeneration is not working well if it's not seeking to empower local communities, and that's the broad range and diverse of our communities. So you talked about a number of good examples in Peckham, in which is Peckham Palms, Peckham Levels, and other examples in Camberwell and right across the borough. And what we sought to do there is have a model of not just ownership, but a model of running it, which seek to prioritise those projects representing their local community and having that at the heart of what we classify as success. So on the Levels, when it first opened, one of the key indicators as to whether it was a success or not, is the degree of diversity in the businesses that open up there. And I think the challenge for regeneration projects, not just not just moving forward, but it's always going to be a consistent challenge, is ensuring that we are setting those milestones that all of the projects moving forward, whether it be business, employment, community, health, ensuring that those projects are reflective of the diversity of the communities that they seek to represent. And the only way we can do that, and is how we are seeking to address that, is by empowering community groups and businesses through those projects as well. So on the Oak Kent Road, we've got a really interesting idea in terms of Livesey Exchange Hall, which will open in 18 months, which will be similar to Peckham Levels and others, using the investment in the area to be able to support, in this case, a BAME run project on the Oak Kent Road.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Johnson. If I could ask a subject to anyone else popping up on the chat. Really positive to hear your suggestions around looking a bit closer at monitoring in terms of existing requirements, and also looking at the kind of wording of the SPD, the Section 106 and SEAL SPD. That's all fantastic. I wanted to get on the pilot idea. I think the Commission. Well, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think the Commission can broadly welcomes the idea of piloting an approach that built on some of the learnings we saw from SLPN. I wondered if you might just in your report there were some reservations around it, and we just, as a Commission, we wanted to balance that with kind of SLPN talking about managing to get 70+ million of business to kind of Southwark-based businesses. So I just wanted to understand some of our kind of specific reservations. Like, is it that we feel like that was a really specific context, or are there kind of other things driving any reservations of ours? And if I could just tag on one more thing, we had a late report that we're going to discuss briefly from Good People, and it spoke a bit towards that idea of, are there more innovative ways that you can try and deliver some additional benefits from both procurement and planning activity? So going beyond the kind of jobs board model towards actual pooling of candidates or similar. Is there a willingness to kind of pilot other innovative ways that we could try and increase local benefit from activity in the borough?
Yeah, so I'll address the first question first. In respect of any reservations on the recommendation put forward in terms of the SLPN, what's driving that reservation? I wouldn't really call it a reservation. It's very much just stemmed from the fact that the advice that had been received on those particular points was just registering the legal advice, is registering the limitations in enforcing it on developers. That being said, as I've said, I'm happy to commit to, we would be happy to explore it in a specific pilot in which we can identify in a key area of regeneration for us, working with a strategic partner to develop on some of those relationships and how that would look like in terms of those contracts, and then be able to take that learning to be able to take it elsewhere as well. And then if you couple that with the monitoring improvements that we want to see, we would be confident that we can further build on what we already have at the moment. So I wouldn't call them reservations. It was just recognizing that the legal advice that we had in terms of to what degree was this actually enforceable, and we didn't want to create a situation where you had a really good idea but it just wasn't enforceable in that sense. And also it probably was stemming from a little bit of history and recognizing from the officer point of view of how similar projects might have gone before and how we've learnt the lessons from those similar projects in the past as well. So I wouldn't say there are reservations, it was just very much how have we learnt the lessons from what's happened in the past, and how do we ensure that whatever project, whatever recommendations we have moving forward, we have the tools to be able to carry them out and to carry them out effectively as well. And so I'm happy to commit to that pilot. And I might have missed the final part of your second point.
It was really just asking if there was openness to other innovative ideas. For example, if you had a chance to look at the Good People paper, which just talked about the potential for, say, for example, additional employment, additional things that could be done to encourage local employment. So more generally, just that openness to innovative ways to maximise local benefit from development activity in the borough. Johnson, you're on mute.
Hello? Hello? Okay. Yeah, so it's really important that we remain open in terms of what works. We know that the economy is significantly shifting. It was shifting even before this pandemic, and we know that it will shift further as well. So we're constantly reviewing what works in terms of getting people into jobs, supporting businesses as well. Classic example is that we continuously review our Southwark work contract to be able to ensure that we are looking at, well, what's the best way to get people into employment, and how do we ensure we're working with the best organisations to be able to do that. And that's something that we continuously reflect on. And similarly with with business support as well. I know the local economy team are continuously looking at what levels of support for businesses is needed. There was a focus on supporting people in terms of taking on living wage jobs. I know there's been work, you know, if I say so, that you've led on in respect to the Pioneer funding, and that's come on leaps and bounds. So it's important that we remain open. And I know that it's something that we have been doing and will continue to do in months and years ahead.
Danny, I think it's coming as well. Go ahead.
I was on mute. Thank you, Pete. So I was just going to add a couple of points to what Johnson said. Just on the Good People proposal, I've looked at that as well. It's just worth recognising that we've had several conversations with Good People on this, and absolutely we welcome any innovative ways to deliver positive outcomes for residents. And actually, a lot of what Good People are suggesting is recognised through our skill strategy approach, which is about looking at innovative ways, using technology to engage local residents and to support them to access opportunities in the job market. So it's something we're very cognizant of in a skill strategy context anyway. Just an additional point on the South London procurement network model. That is a recognised model, and it's not unique to the South London procurement network. I think there is a unique context there in that they were working with a very willing developer in Canary Wharf, and that undoubtedly helped with the success of that project. I think for us, there's two things. There's working with SMEs to help them to become procurement ready and able to access contracts, and that's a critical part of the package of support. And then there's working with developers and how you influence developer behaviour to help them, to support them to buy locally. I think you need to do both, and I think, you know, the challenges that Johnson's mentioned in terms of influencing buyer behaviour, they're levers of influence, they're not levers of control, and I think that kind of explains some of the reticence if you're picking up on that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for all of that. There's kind of clear things that we can take on board in the context of the reports that we'll come to that we'll come to later. You're of course welcome to stay on for that conversation, but don't feel obliged to. It's going to principally be focused on members' feedback around those reports. So moving to the next item on the agenda, I'm going to suggest a slight shuffle because we don't have anyone speaking to item 6, the Chance UK report. So we'll move next to item 7, which is the officer briefings in relation to the exclusions review. Now, I'm conscious that all these materials were shared on time, so I don't want us to spend too long going through those. If we do have people to speak to them on the line still, just double checking. Great. Yeah, I'm kind of eager that we don't spend too much time going through these, but maybe we could just kind of headline each document and then move to questions as necessary. Please indicate on the chat if you're going to have a question or raise your hand function.
Okay, my name's Neil Gordon-Orr from Education Access and Service Development Lead. So I drafted the papers on off-rolling and also on NEET young people. And they were shared some time ago, so I won't dwell on too much of the detail. But essentially, the issue of the off-rolling was raised in the Timpson review, and it's basically a mechanism for getting children out of the school without having to go through a formal exclusion process, either by persuading a parent to withdraw their child or removing them from the register in other circumstances. So it's become a big focus in recent years, particularly through Ofsted taking quite a strong look at it. And in Southwark, as in other boroughs, the school have to tell the local authority whenever a child leaves and the reason for that. And what we found is, the overwhelming majority of children who leave schools in Southwark do so for completely normal, legitimate reasons. They're moving school, we've got a highly mobile population, people are moving in and out of the borough all the time. So most people who are leaving schools are doing so in order to move to another school or to move elsewhere in the country. There are some children who are permanently excluded, and there are some children who parents remove them to be home educated. So we haven't found any evidence of systematic off-rolling in Southwark. We did an exercise late last year, following the Ofsted methodology, which is looking at all the children in year 10, looking again at the children in year 11, and seeing whether there were children who had left who the schools hadn't told us about. And really, we found that in most cases there weren't. There was one school where there was 11 children they hadn't told us about who had left between year 10 and 11. But mostly it was 1 or 2. And we followed that up, going back to the schools and asking for an explanation those children they hadn't told us about. And in all cases, they were able to provide us with evidence of where they'd gone. And it seemed to be mainly an administrative issue why they hadn't completed the forms for all children. So to conclude on that one, really, I don't think there is evidence of off-rolling. There may be 1 or 2 cases, but we do challenge if a school tells us that they're removing a child from the register because the child hasn't been attending, for instance. We do note that back because if we know where that child's living and there's no evidence that they've moved out of the borough, we expect the school to keep them on the roll and to be taking enforcement action around attendance with support from the early help service. So there is a challenge when we think they're not following the rules. And I think the thing that's made a big difference, apart from our own increase in scrutiny of it within the local authority, is Ofsted are really all over this now. I gave an example in the paper there of when they did inspect a school, it was a Harris school late last year. And during that inspection, the inspector actually phoned us up in the local authority, asked us which children we'd been notified about, checked that our records corresponded with the school's record. And on that occasion, they gave the school a clean bill of health. But I think it sent a clear message around to everybody that when Ofsted come in, they are asking questions about which children have left, why have they left, where have they gone, are you sure you haven't been off-rolling? And if they are found to have been engaged in off-rolling, they would be in line for an inadequate inspection on safeguarding and leadership grounds. So I don't want to be complacent about it. We continue to monitor it, but our overview is that we haven't found evidence of any systematic off-rolling, and only 1 or 2 cases where schools have been open to challenge.
Thanks very much. Do any of the other officers want to take a I'm going to take silence as assent. If I could kick this off, just one point about that. It did feel slightly complacent at places, if I'm to be totally honest, and it was just trying to balance trying to reconcile that we flag that there's that we had submissions where we had to actively track and get the information, but the fact that we had a call to where we didn't seemed problematic. And then the second piece was that we flagged 5 out of 19 kind of abnormally high levels of leaving the role. Now, just that seems to reflect. I mean, that seems to suggest some level of issue. No, wouldn't that be a read of it that those stats are at least concerning in some way?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up and I couldn't really hear the questions. Was it about the fact correlation between the children leaving the school in general and the numbers for exclusions?
Is my connection better now?
Yeah, I can hear you, but it's a bit broken.
Okay, I'll briefly try one more time. I'll keep it brief as possible. Yeah. 5 out of 19 schools initially flagged up as a concern for numbers of children leaving the role. These forms submitted for 74% of children. That those do feel like concerning figures.
They do, but I think it's important to contextualise them in terms of numbers per school. So that 74% represented 22 children. 11 of those were from one school, which was failing to provide us with regular notifications of children leaving. So if you take those out of the picture, that school has been challenged. It's not one of the ones you've named in your wider report. And they have given an explanation of those children. So there was following the audit, there was a very strong challenge from our assistant director to that school. I think if you take those ones out of the picture, then it's 11 children from 19 schools who they appear to have failed to complete the form. So there's some concern about that, but I think the point of the audit was to clarify exactly what the position was and to challenge that. And the follow-up was a very strong letter to all those schools, reminding them of what the process was, quoting what Ofsted was saying about it. And there has been some useful dialogue with schools after that. I mean, I've been into one of the Harris schools, for instance, where they were able to show very positive measures they were taking to make sure that they were letting us know about all these children. We matched our data with their data. So I think if we didn't know what's going on and we weren't challenging the schools, I would say that would be complacent. But the follow-up from this has been very strong with the schools.
Peter, I can't raise my hand or put something on meeting chat for some reason.
Okay,
Lynette.
Okay, Lynette, go ahead. Got a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I agree with Peter. It sounds as if everything in the garden is absolutely rosy and there is no problem at all. And yet we know nationally and in Southwark that there are children that are lost to education or in fact are not on the books of any local authority once they leave a school, perhaps somewhere else. How can you be so sure that every child is accountable to you and to the school, and that you know exactly what is happening? Because it's a national problem, and I cannot imagine that Southwark is different from any other boroughs. I hate to be so challenging, but this is such an important issue.
Yeah, I think
and
there's
a supplementary question.
Yeah.
With home education,
Yeah.
what measures are you putting in to ensure that there is education going on?
Yeah.
You could say something about that. I'm sure it would be illuminating. Thank you.
Yeah, there's 2 points there. I mean, the first point is there are children who are missing education, who are not attending school. That's another issue which I can brief on separately. But they're not necessarily. It's not necessarily the case that they become missing education because they've been illegally off-rolled by a school. They may be missing education for other reasons. They may, for instance, have moved into the borough. They may have been withdrawn by their parent to be home educated, which I'll come back to in a moment. So the fact that there are undoubtedly children who are have fallen out of the system one way or another, or a much larger issue, I would say, is that there are many children who are on the roll of the school who are in fact rarely attending schools and have very low attendance. But that's not the same issue as off-rolling, which to accuse school of off-rolling is really to say that they have acted in effect illegally to remove a child from the register, which we would take very seriously. And we just haven't got any evidence that that is happening. There have been cases where I've personally been involved in where schools have attempted to do it. For instance, one quite recently I was involved in where there's actually an out-of-borough school, but with this other child. If you can't take a child off the roll of school just because they're not going to school. And a school did try to do that. We met with the head teacher, we met with early help, we put in place a package to get that child back on the roll. So I'm not saying there's no such thing as off-rolling. I don't think we have any conclusive evidence that it's happening, so that we are checking, we're asking. Every time we get a child who leaves a school, we scrutinise the reason given for it. But I think schools now, to be honest, are quite rightly very afraid of being found to be off-rolling, because it is such a big focus on officers' inspection that if they were found to be doing it, that in its own right would be enough for them to no longer be a good school, and no school wants to be in that position. So that's, if there has been evidence presented to the Commission that there are children who are being off-rolled, then we would certainly investigate further, but I really haven't been able to find evidence of it. The home education.
Home education. Oh, sorry, you were getting there. Apologies.
Yeah, the home education question. Yes, there's been, as you were seeing, there has been a significant increase in the number of children being home educated in Southwark, and nationally over the last few years, it's more or less doubled in Southwark to over 200 children. When parents do choose to home educate, they are opting out of the system. They are taking on full responsibility for their child's education. They don't need our permission to do it, and our legal powers are relatively limited. However, we do have a couple of home education advisors whose job it is to contact those parents. We do ask parents to provide evidence that they are providing a suitable education, and where they don't, where they aren't able to provide evidence of suitable education, we encourage them to get their children back into school. The biggest concern for me in that group really is that, and this is where it does perhaps kind of relate to this off-rolling debate, there are children whose parents choose to home educate because they've got very strong beliefs that's the best thing for their children. But there are children, on the other hand, who are home educated because their parents think that's a less worse option than being permanently excluded or being prosecuted for non-attendance. So they're choosing a loophole of going to home educate purely to avoid a negative consequence for them. not because they've chosen that as a path for their children. And those are the ones where we do have the most concern. And many of those children would also be open to either social services or early help. And there's a lot of work done to try and persuade those parents that if it's not working out, to get them back into school. Though our legal powers are limited, the government was consulting on some stronger powers earlier in the year, which would give local authorities a right and a duty to inspect home education, which we don't currently have. That's been delayed, but we hope that will come in soon. There's been a lot of lobbying from the Association of Directors of Children's Services, like our own director, to strengthen the powers we have around that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Neil. I'll take one last question from William. William, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much for your presentation. Just to reduce off-rolling, proposing a sort of national statistics or a target to the school, just to check, for the school to be accountable, because at the moment we feel like schools, they don't have a national target in terms of permanent and fixed term exclusion. So having those targets and statistics, do you believe that it will have a better effect in reducing off-rolling? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, Neil, before you come back, could I just ask, Renata's indicated that she has one question as well, just so we can take them together. Renata, do you want to come in with your question?
Yes, I will come in now. It was just about the off-rolling, possible off-rolling and home educated children. Do you know what proportion of home, any idea of what proportion of home educated children had temporary exclusions or were in full-time, were in school and then left school to be home educated? Do you have any idea of what proportion of what number?
I don't know the figures to hand, but we have got that analysis. Certainly, I think there's around a third of home educated children have had some previous involvement from either early help, which is often related to attendance, or student social care, or camps, which suggests some other levels of need. And I would say that the majority of children have previously been in school at some point. In some cases, the parents have moved them out of school because they're unhappy with the situation there. Then maybe they believe their child's being bullied or whatever. But the ones which is hard to get clear data for is really if a child maybe would have been excluded but hasn't been excluded because they've gone down the home education route as an alternative. So it is quite a high proportion, and I can find the exact figures if you want to. Yeah, sure.
Yes, please.
And could you come back on William's question as well, please, Neil?
That's about the data issue, wasn't it? About what's published. I mean, there is data published on exclusions. In terms of data on children leaving the schools, we've done our own local analysis of it, but it doesn't really tell you very much because it may just be a school, a very popular school tends to have high retention of children. Less popular schools, children tend to leave to go to other schools if their parents get the opportunity to. They may just be in an area where there's more mobility. But Ofsted has certainly been trying to do some more detailed analysis using the same method we did, which is really seeing, can you compare how there have been what they're calling exceptional levels of movement. For Ofsted purposes, they're saying if more than 5% of children have left between year 10 and year 11, that's considered to be exceptional nationally. But they haven't actually published any league tables on it, and I think it probably would be, generally speaking, if you publish data like that, it does increase the level of accountability. So that's certainly something we can look at. I mean, we provide the data to this commission. We share that data with the schools. We could consider making some of that local data more widely available.
Fantastic. Thanks thanks very much, Neil, and to other officers who joined there. So I'm kind of satisfied that we've sufficiently covered off briefings, all of the briefings under item 7. There's not pressing questions on the others of those. I'm going to suggest now that we that we move on and that we try and note a couple of the items where there's just papers that have been received before having another 5-minute break. So if I could move next to item 6, which is Chance UK's contributions to the exclusion review. If there were one thing to note there, it would be that they point towards kind of three main factors that the council should be especially aware of. Firstly, about the importance of looking at the question of exclusions at primary school. Secondly, around the need to provide early mental health and other relevant support for children. And then finally, something that we haven't touched on much as a commission, ensuring that there's enough focus on the families of young children who are at risk of exclusion. So I think it's a really good point to flag, at least. If there's not any kind of specific comments on the Chance UK report, or are there any specific comments on the Chance UK report that people would like to make? Lynette, no? Okay, great. So I'll just take that report as noted then. And then the next item to note is item 9. So the procurement, this relates to the procurement review, where we've got a couple of briefings that have been provided by officers. One looking at the rollout of the Fairer Futures procurement framework, and the other update an update from Children and Adult Services, who had some pilot activity trying to make procurement more accessible to SMEs. Again, I'd suggest we just note both of those reports. They provide additional information that has been reflected in the draft report we have in our packs. Okay, everyone seems okay with that. So that leaves us with 3 remaining items, looking at the 2 reports and then a brief discussion on the work programme for next year. But I'm going to suggest that we take the 5-minute break now. It can be slightly extended, so if we return at 8:05, and we'll be wrapped by 9. If we can be earlier than that, that would be a bonus. Please don't forget to turn your mics and your cameras off. we're home straight now, folks. Okay, I think we're good to be back in business now. Julie, do we have you as well? If we do have you, Julie, you're on mute. I'll get started if that's all right. So the next item on the agenda is item 8, the school exclusions and alternative provision scrutiny report. So you'll have had the report in your agenda packs. I think there's two or three things to cover off. One, there's been a couple matters arising from this session, which I think we might want to reflect. But then it would just be good to get any comments on the document as is, and agree the process for finalizing it is the final thing. If we could start maybe with the paper as it currently stands. I haven't had any comments in advance from members suggested any changes. Are there any kind of specific areas people think we might need to make a change or wanted to otherwise comment on? Eleanor, is that you wanting to say something? Yeah, it looks like it might be.
Yeah.
Great.
It's very late in the day, so apologies. I dropped you a few thoughts via email just before the meeting. I'm happy to repeat them, or they're sort of, or they're things that you want to deal with them by email. Up to you. I've got one kind of further comment coming out of today, but happy to deal with that next.
If you're happy that it can be like kind of readily resolved outside of the meeting, that's fine. If it's like broader substantive, then feel free to bring it up now.
I mean, I'm happy to. There's only 3 points, so I'll on this one. So, I thought I was quite struck by the report on NEET, where they talked about the correlation between exclusions and people who are known to Southwark Care Service and are known to have witnessed domestic violence, and that was also something that Matt mentioned in his presentation. So, just wondered if that was a link that perhaps we should bring out a bit more. I also thought, as Julie said, I think the report's really good, and it's just like, it's a real credit to your chairing. It's really thorough and covers all the issues really comprehensively that we've been discussing over the past year. What I sort of thought, I know it's probably obvious to us, but perhaps worth highlighting the kind of the costs of exclusion. So both to the individuals and society, the loss of opportunities for the individuals, the increased risk of offending, the knife crime that we see in Southwark, those kind of costs perhaps worth stating at the beginning. And then the other one, I thought that I wasn't quite sure whether this was a recommendation or just something that we needed to pull out a bit, but on the mental health, just maybe linking the council's commitment to treat 100% of young people with mental health, diagnosed mental health conditions. I think it's such a I know Councillor Ali rightly talks about it a lot. It's such a big policy commitment. So I just wonder if there's a link between what we're doing and what that's and then that kind of objective of the council. So they were my kind of comments on reading the report before this session.
Great, that's really helpful, Eleanor. I don't really need to discuss this further. Those comments do make sense. For the second and third, there were some points where things were reflected, so it may be about making sure it's brought out clearly brought out clearly enough, and I think the point on the NEETs is an additional one which could be reflected in some way. Did any other members want to come back with any specific comments on the report as it currently stands? Great. Okay, I'll take that. So the kind of second piece on this report is just any tweaks that or things that we might want to incorporate from today's meeting. And what I've flagged is from the conversation with Matt Jones, as Eleanor said, just making sure we're clearly reflecting some of that connection with NEETs. I think Matt shared a general enthusiasm for bolder partnerships. Whilst he spoke specifically to a model that the council might try, I'm not sure that the report needs to determine any question. It's more about the fact that any renewed partnership between schools and the council, which is going to achieve 100% inclusion, needs to have like genuine openness about the approach we take to things like alternative provision and beyond, and real commitment to improving the coverage of kind of mental health support and other appropriate support to children who need it before they're at the point of exclusion. Did others flag other things that they think needs to be added to the report based on this evening's session? Eleanor, go ahead. You want to come in again?
Thanks, Peter. And it was just to follow up on your point on Matt. I thought he said some really interesting things about, you know, different kind of models and, you know, kind of changing, I guess, what would be changing the structure of how the council do something in comparison to being kind of more radical and more kind of sort of, I think it was like grassroots led. I think you're right that I don't think we've got the information to kind of suggest particular models or that the council does stuff, but I just wonder if it would be good to capture, you know, that idea of the council, you know, being radical and being prepared to try new things in order to get to, you know, 100% inclusion. If we can capture that as a principle, I mean, I think it would be great to be able to say more on that, but I don't think we can really do that without kind of seeing, you know, specific examples of you know, different kind of models there.
Thanks, Eleanor. Renata, you've indicated you have a point. Sorry if you made it a while ago. I've just seen it.
No, well, just that from the last speaker, he said he could come back with the figures of what proportion of home educated children and what the numbers were who previously had a history of exclusions, of temporary exclusions, and that maybe we would want to integrate those figures because that could give us an idea of the numbers of home educated children who are actually effectively excluded children. And also, because of the other report that there was no speak about on early intervention at primary level, I don't know if we want to take that on board and integrate that a little bit more into the reports. You know, how we could prevent maybe it getting to the senior level, and also because in Southwark we have more influence probably what happens at primary level because more primary schools are, well, because some primary schools are under Southwark's control, while at secondary none of them are under Southwark's control. Anyway, just a couple of points.
Yeah, okay, we'll take those on board. The second one, there's some content there, so it might be about the emphasis on it, and I think agreed we can incorporate any figures on the proportion of home educated children who I presume have been subject to multiple exclusions or something along those lines. We can certainly incorporate that if we get the data back from officers in time. Those are all the all the points I've identified. Eliza or Lynette, did either of you want to come in with something? Okay, Lynette, go ahead. You're on mute at the moment, Lynette. If you see a microphone shape, Lynette, next to a video camera, then press that. I think Lynette's having some problems unmuting her device. Eliza, did you want to come in with anything, or are you okay? Just wasn't Lynette sorting herself out? Okay, Lynette can't quite make it in just yet. I think people will be okay if we, Lynette, if you feed it in either afterwards, or if you have Julie's mobile, you could text her what you wanted to say, so we can at least get it on the record, if possible. But okay, on the basis of what I've heard from people, I think we're broadly okay to finalise the report, subject to the subject to those amends that we've discussed being made, and happy to kind of circulate one last time with commission members once those changes have been made. Okay, great. I'm seeing plenty of head nodding, so we can move on to the next item, which is the procurement report. So that will be that's item 10. So the procurement and social value report. Now, if we could do the same process on that, so if people come back with any comments they had on the report as it currently stands. Oh, I've got an indication from, sorry, I'm just seeing that Jenny's offered to talk to Summerhouse. Jenny, I'm going to suggest that you don't on this stage. I mean, I felt the report was particularly clear, and we do have enough to go on in terms of talking about the importance of primary more. So I'm going to suggest that we hold on that at this stage. So just returning to the procurement report, did anybody have comments on the report as it currently stands? No, great, goodo. So in terms of possible additions based on this session, the main I've got three. One is 3.5. One is based on the update from Councillor Shitu, just a recognition that the monitoring of existing Section 106 commitments relating to using local businesses could be tightened up and improved. So I think that's a ready recommendation for us to get behind. Then the second was whether we could adjust one of our recommendations which talks about the SLPN model to speak about a specific pilot in a given area. And I think given all that's happening on the Old Kent Road, that feels like quite a natural place where we know that there's going to be a major development relationship. So we could suggest, for example, Old Kent Road or another site like Canada Water, but just one of the major development sites in the borough could be the suggestion. And then the kind of final point he alluded to is in the statutory procurement document, the SPD, whether the wording there gets tightened up about what we can ask developers for, subject to appropriate legal advice. And that's another thing I think we can quite readily get behind. Were there any other changes to the report that people thought might be needed off the basis of either Councillor Shittu's comments or some of the other papers shared today? No? Okay. Great. So subject to those three changes, we'll take that report as finalised as well. If I could take this opportunity before we kind of touch on the work programme to just say thank you to everyone for so thoroughly approaching a scrutiny across what are two quite diverse topic areas. And I feel like we've really been able to get under the skin of what are complex issues, and produce recommendations that stand to have a really positive impact if they can be implemented effectively. So I just want to extend my thanks to all of you, to Julie as project manager as well. We've managed to bring in a really wide range of participants. I think we've managed to create a space where we have frank conversations aimed at finding constructive solutions. So a massive thank you to all of you. It's been a real pleasure chairing this commission over the course of this year. Yeah, so thank you all for that. But this isn't a normal year, and so this isn't quite the end of this commission as it typically would be. And in any case, I think it's within the remit of a commission to kind of look towards its work program going forward. So I suggest that we spend a little bit of time on item 11, which is just thinking through the work program for the year ahead. And rather than looking too far, there's due to be another meeting in July, and I think given the speed with which things are evolving, there's some benefit for just thinking first what might we want to cover in July, and then any ideas we can float for the new year is to be noted, but that's a bit of a bonus. If I could just start the ball rolling, it's like COVID-19 is having such an impact across our borough and affecting children, particularly vulnerable children's ability to access education, and raising a whole range of questions around how the council's kind of responding from to people's ability to access education, to attend schools, the sorts of provision that are happening. And by the time that the commission would be meeting, schools would have reopened, so there'll be a range of questions about kind of how they've reopened, how safety is being maintained of children and beyond. And on the procurement side as well, we stand to have COVID-19 stands to have a devastating effect on businesses across the borough. A significant number have already closed. Many think that they're on the path to closing because business as usual is not coming back anytime soon. So looking at the council's response, there's been a range of activity already in terms of applying government grants, creating local authority grants, and it'd be really good to understand that emergency response, but also some of the longer term plans in terms of assuring that there's still a vibrant local economy in Southwark. So those feel like kind of quite natural topics for us to pick up into July. I think that's soon enough for us to be looking at some of these questions, and they're so big that I'd imagine that they will flow into the next year as well. They might have specific additional themes, for example, like just high streets more generally, like what's the future for high streets in the context of COVID. So there might be some specific themes that emerge relating to the effects of COVID, but I imagine that anything we do over the next year is going to have some COVID related aspect to it. Do others want to come in with their initial reflections, thoughts about what we might cover? Eleanor, you look like you're poised to move. Great.
That was well spotted. I didn't know whether to use a chat function or we'd kind of reduced into a more intimate Teams chat. I mean, on the business one, I think you're absolutely right. On COVID, so two thoughts. The first one was, I mean, I don't know. I know that we're all getting updates on schools and education all the time. So I don't know if we want to, if it's helpful, kind of ask any kind of urgent questions to Councillor Ali, or we feel like the other avenues of the council's being updated are sufficient. And my second sort of one was, I think on business, I mean, maybe it's broadening it too much again, but I think as well as COVID, like just looking at the kind of the resilience of Southwark's businesses, because in the coming year, they are going to have both the actual lockdown effects of COVID and then the effects on the economy, and then potentially Brexit, potentially a no deal Brexit. So just that kind of, you know, how resilient are our businesses? What can the council do to help? I mean, we've already done huge amounts of business grants, but in the longer term, what else are we going to kind of do for this recession that we sort of didn't see coming a few months ago?
A really helpful comments, Eleanor, and I think that's totally right. I mean, before COVID kicked in, we were going to have a look at the effects of Brexit on local businesses. So broadening it to a question about resilience makes great sense. Did others want to come in with any thoughts about what we might cover, or to respond to Eleanor's points about whether we should raise urgent questions about schools? Eliza, I've seen your hand, so do you want to say something? Eliza, you're on mute, so if you turn that off, then you can speak, and then we'll have Renata afterwards.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you now.
Okay. I think, like what you said, we ought to look at the impact of COVID and on the children and in the school, and we haven't had a vaccine yet. We haven't got any medication for it. Young people are less affected, but you never know if it goes on forever. So we must make sure the environment in school is adequate to protect the children, and they are maintaining their social distancing, and also the teachers more meals. I think they only provide breakfast, so probably we need to make sure they have adequate food so that their immune system will be really boosted. So we need to look after the health of this virus, so we can look into that, and probably July will be the time. Probably the children would have gone back to school in the beginning of June if it happens, so we could see some changes. And regarding the business, we need to bring back the business, otherwise the economy is going down, and the recovery will be difficult. So lots of people will not have food anymore if the government runs out of fund and the council runs out of fund. So how safely they can open their business, so that we need to find from the experts how well or how safe they can really start opening their businesses. We only relying on supermarkets now. Most of the things are not available either. So
really helpful comments, Eliza. Thank you. And I agree with all of that. William, next. I'm not seeing any others indicating. So William, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Definitely COVID-19.
I think I just missed Renata. Apologies. Renata
should I let her go first?
Do you mind if I let Renata go in? Just you know.
I don't mind at all. I'm a gentleman. I don't mind at all.
Very, very kind of you. I, on the other hand, are very rude. Renata, go ahead.
Okay. Just a couple of things leading on from what Eleanor said. I think that the hospitality, the nighttime economy, restaurants, live music, that's going to be particularly badly affected, because there's no end in sight for those types of businesses, which are very, very prevalent within our borough. There are huge numbers of such businesses affected. I don't know if you'd be interested to do something on that, on the impact on nighttime economy businesses. And the other thing about schools, which I've seen nothing on in the press, about the exam years 11 and 13, who basically now have effectively left school without having done their exams. The teachers are estimating their grades, and evidence from the past with results are estimated when they go off to universities. They normally are underestimated for children from poorer backgrounds and overestimated for children from more affluent backgrounds. And there's been nothing said what will happen about those children who will need to resit exams in the autumn, about the financial implications. Are they going to extend the zip cards? Now, at the moment, they're going to actually suspend the zip cards to children for travel to education. Will they be able to go back to school to finish off their courses before these autumn exams? Because not having your 5 GCSEs, including in English and maths, affects you forever if you haven't got that. And those from poorer backgrounds are more likely to get their grades underestimated. So I don't know if we want to have a look at the outcomes of within our borough's children of the exam years.
That's a really interesting suggestion, Renata, and I think I saw some head nodding around the virtual table. There's probably a bit of an exercise to do in terms of thinking about how we might best scope and approach that, and but happy to explore that with officers to see if we can like give that a decent treatment. And then I think there'll also be a question of whether that's whether we can do that justice in the July session, or if it might need to come later. Any other suggestions in terms of future work program? No?
I don't know, Chair. I thought I was coming after Renata.
Oh, sorry.
I thought I was making a comment after.
Apologies. I'm heading.
I understand, Chair. We're almost at the end. So.
Indeed, yeah. So, William, go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly. Definitely, COVID-19 will have an impact in the education or the business area. In terms of education, I think all the strategic decisions we've seen, all the best practice we've seen will have to be reconsidered and reviewed for the well-going of the education nationally. In terms of business, I think we have Brexit at the wrong time, at a global economic recession, and it's going to knock down not only the big businesses but also the small businesses. And the council should take a lead in terms of how to bring together the entire community, different stakeholders, to cooperate together, and also to give some portion of the business to small businesses for them to survive. For me, I think it will be the best way forward to be resilient in this era of Brexit and also a global economic recession.
Thanks, William. Good points to end on. And I mean, I think we've tried to, with the procurement report as well, just to say a little bit about Brexit and the fact that it both creates a greater need for the local economy to be strengthened through council activity, but it also potentially becomes an opportunity to do it. So happy to kind of have it on the forward agenda and make sure it's reflected in the existing reports as well. So if nobody else wants to come in with comments on the work program at this stage, then there isn't any there's no closed business or other items for this meeting. So if I could just say, I've got one message on the chat. Let me just check. Okay. Yeah, if I could just say thanks again to everybody for all of their contributions over the year, and looking forward to kind of taking things up further come July. Okay, meeting's concluded. Thanks all. Have a great night. Great. Bye.
Thank you.